first church I ever pastored was a church in a bar. There was this bar that I frequented when I was, in my younger days and I could stay up late, And over time, there was this group of guys that began gathering around the table at this bar where we sat a couple times a month. Eventually, what I began to realize was around this table were all guys who had left the church. They all had left the church, and for good reason. One of the guys around the table was served in our military, a couple terms in Iraq, and his dad was a really predominant pastor in our town, and he was gay, and very few people knew. Can you imagine the life he would have lived growing up? Another fellow at the table who once started a church, and the church was growing, and people were coming around the church, and someone from the denomination came and that he was a part of and came and visited his church, and they didn't like the kinds of people who were gathering in that church, so they shut him down. And this once pastor with this broken heart was never ever able to find himself back in the church again. One of the guys at the table ran this big youth hangout center in our town. And as I got to know him, I found out that he used to be a pastor and began asking questions in his church that apparently he wasn't allowed to ask. And they pushed him out. One by one, I began realizing around this table was story after story after story of folks who had left the church, and for good reason. Well, on one night, they decided that I am now their pastor, and they were going to be my board. And so at somewhere between the hours of 11:30 at night and 1:30 in the morning, they began calling this board meeting to order. They began bringing problems in the church to their pastor. And they said, "Pastor, what are we going to do about this one? You won't believe what they did. Have you heard what they said? Do you know they stopped doing, And then we would vote on whether or not this person would be excommunicated from the church or not. They'd, all right, hands in, right? Someone would make a motion. Someone would second a motion, and all would say aye or nay, and there might have been a few other drinks shared after the vote. On that night, we shut the bar down. And I was standing outside the bar with actually the guy who invited me into this group. And I think what he was trying to do was express gratitude for the way in which I just listened to these guys share around the table. That these fellas, his friends, for the first time began to open up and tell some of the stories of pain that they had experienced in the church. I think he wanted to kind of thank me for going through this satirical exercise as a part of maybe their healing journey or their healing process. But I think he also wanted me to know that I could be honest about maybe some of the things that I was feeling. That he was safe for me to maybe share some of my own doubts, my own struggles with theology, my struggles with the church and how it operates. He didn't quite have the words for it, but what he said to me that night is he said, "Pastor, what I want you to know is that more important than honesty is loyalty." He said, "I'm loyal to you before anything else." He said, loyalty over honesty. And I was like, what does that mean? How many drinks have you had tonight? And so we eventually went home, and I went to bed that night, and I don't know if this has ever happened to you. I woke up 3 hours later, before 4:30 in the morning. I couldn't sleep. And I just felt like my brain was spinning and turning. Anyone else have this challenge at times? But on this night, I actually felt like God was saying something to me. I felt like God said, I want you to get out of bed and listen to me for a bit. And so I got out of bed, and I got out my journal. And God just began kind of talking to me about the words that came out of my drunk friend that night. Loyalty over honesty. And how the ways in which this is actually the story of God. the story of God is a God who offers loyalty to people. And that it's in the safety of that loyalty that we can actually begin to be honest about some of the things in our hearts, in our lives, in our world. And the third part of that was that when we're in this relationship of loyalty and honesty, what can emerge is good theology, a right understanding of God. You know, as I've sat with people, like a lot of people, over the last decade of being a pastor who have left the church. I don't know how this happened to me, but somehow I've become like a magnet for people who have left the church and are looking for a pastor. It's how a lot of us ended up here too, right? Just trying to figure all that out. And as I've listened to story after story after story, what I've been learning over the last decade is all of these stories begin to depict some kind of relationship between those three words: loyalty, honesty, and theology. Loyalty, honesty, and theology. I spent almost a decade of my life leading worship in 3 to 4 churches a week all over the country. Lots of times we would lead these like gatherings of like high school students that would come together and we would kind of sing like church songs for high school kids, you know? And then after these events, we would end up at like the token youth group gathering point, Applebee's for late night half-price apps. Anyone grew up in youth group culture, right? Like every youth group in the country is at Applebee's at like 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, right? And we'd end up at Applebee's, there'd be all these students hanging out, we'd be having a great time, and you know, I'd end up at the end of the table with like the adult who's responsible for all these teenagers. And often what would happen was they begin to share maybe some of the things that they're working through in their theology. Things they're beginning to question about God or question about the church. And they had no one else to talk to. Because if they talked about these things in their church, they'd be silenced or pushed out. Or some of them worked for those churches. And if they talked about these things in their churches, man, they might lose their jobs, lose their friends, lose their community. Some of them would have these stories about how like some elders or leaders in the church want these certain kinds of teenagers not to come around the church anymore because they broke something in the lobby or they were smoking outside, right? And how they began to try and stand up for those young people in their church. And how they're getting all this kind of pressure to conform to these leaders of the church. Let's begin to share their heart. And so Pastor Josh and I Josh was in that band with me, and we traveled together all those years. We'd get back into our van, you know, somewhere around 11 o'clock at night, filled with grease from Applebee's, feeling terrible, you know. And we began to have this conversation about the nature of loyalty and honesty and theology. Often Pastor Josh would say to me as we're telling the stories of the night, he would say to me, there it is. Loyalty, opening the door for honesty. But just for a moment, that youth pastor, that youth leader, that individual felt safe enough to begin to tell the truth about what's going on in their heart and in their life. Man, probably hundreds of times, Josh or I have looked at each other over the years and go, there it is again. Loyalty over honesty, helping us to develop a good theology. I want to talk about these three words quite a lot today, and I'd like to maybe just talk about what they mean. When I talk about theology today, because this word can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different spaces. The way I think about theology is twofold. Doxy, maybe you've heard the word orthodoxy, which is like right belief, is what orthodoxy means, right belief, right? Often when people use the word theology, all they really mean is orthodoxy. But actually, theology is made up of two parts. it's made up of orthodoxy. It's also made up of praxis or orthopraxy, right action. So good theology, right, how we understand God, is both about right belief, what we believe about God, how we talk about God as people, but also orthopraxis, how we respond to the story of God, how we become different as people because of who God is in our shared life together. The next word that becomes really important here is honesty. Honesty. Now, as I use this word honesty, it might bring up a lot of different maybe emotions or feelings or definitions from your own life. But I'm talking about honesty, especially in the church setting. We want to talk about honesty being the discovery of truth and truth telling, right? It's both. Honesty is this journey where together we discover some truth, capital T, some things about God that we're bearing witness to as being true in our midst. But it's also about telling the truth. It's about when we come across things in our lives that need to be said that are true, we speak those things, that we don't lie or be dishonest. Honesty is about discovery and telling the truth. This last word, loyalty, when I talk about loyalty in the story or loyalty in the church, what I think this needs to be, or at least the right kind of sized loyalty, is about the love of people, not an institution. Often when we talk about loyalty in the church, the way it's spoken of, it's about loyalty to the church. I actually would say that's not the story. That's not the story. The story is about this God who is loyal to people. And the embodied Jesus was so loyal to people and not the institution that it got him crucified. We'll get to that in a minute. I want to look a little bit about how Jesus embodies this in his whole story. Matthew chapter 4 tells the story of Jesus calling a few of his disciples. It's the beginning of Jesus having disciples. Matthew chapter 4 says this, starting in verse 18, as Jesus walked alongside this Galilee sea, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew throwing fishing nets into the sea because they were fishermen. That's really important context, right? Come, follow me, he said, and I'll show you how to fish for people. That was like a great hook line for Jesus, right? Hey, guys, I know what you do for a living. Here's a line for you. Right away, they left their nets, followed him. Continuing on. He saw another set of brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with Zebedee and their father repairing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him. What Jesus is offering his disciples right out of the gate here is loyalty. You can belong with me. You can come with me. You can stay where you are if you want, but if you want to come with me, I will be loyal to you. I'll take care of you. I'll be your rabbi, and you can be my disciples. What's interesting here is that Jesus didn't first check in on their theology. Hey guys, I'm taking applications for my disciples today. If you could write me up a statement of belief, I'm going to go through these statements of belief, and I'm going to pick a few of you that already believe what I believe, and you can come with me. What he didn't even require is honesty. Yeah, I've checked all your Facebook pages. You seem like honest people, right? Out of the gate, Jesus offers them loyalty. He offers them loyalty. As they journey on, the disciples increasingly feel safe enough to be honest. If you read the Gospels, you can follow along. The questions the disciples ask get more and more and more honest the longer they understand the loyalty of Jesus toward them. It was actually this loyalty that led to Jesus' death on the cross. You may not have understood this or read this in the story before, is that the church of the time was really frustrated with Jesus because he was being loyal to people and not the institution of the church. And the government at the time was really frustrated with Jesus because he was being loyal to people and not the institution of government. And so the government and the church got together and said, we got to have this guy killed. Do you know they collaborated on the crucifixion of Jesus? And then Jesus is crucified and is all alone. Those of you that have chosen people over institution have maybe experienced this before, where in the end, you find yourself very isolated as the powers and principalities and systems of the day of those institutions continue to perpetuate a culture that keeps people away from that are loyal to the people and the humans around them. So this series is called Why I Left Church, or Why I Left the Church. And my thought is that some of you are wondering what I'm going to talk about, and maybe for good reason. Maybe you've got some of these experiences of loyalty and theology and honesty that have been all misplaced and unhealthy. And so as we begin this journey, I wanted to maybe help give us a tool, a way to maybe take steps. Like, how do I know when it's safe enough to begin to be honest about some of the things going on in my life or some of the things going on around you? Those of you that are like computer engineers might like this. Anyone know what IFTTT stands for? Say it out loud if you know it. If this, then that, right? Computer programming is if this, then that. I want to give you an if this, then that for this journey. I want to say that if the community you're a part of is promoting loyalty to other human beings and telling a story of a God who is loyal to you no matter what, a God who loves you, no, it does not, that does not change. There's nothing you can do to lose that. If that loyalty is beginning to be communicated and exhibited, then it might be safe enough to start taking some steps of honesty, to begin to maybe trust and find safety inside of that gospel, inside of that story, inside of that community, to begin to maybe tell the truth and bear witness the truth being told. Then what I think will begin to happen is a development of theology. Then in the midst of those steps that you're taking, in the safety of community, my bet is that you'll begin to discover theology, God who is with us in brand new and helpful ways. So I think what the story is about is how the loyalty of God makes honesty in the presence of God, in the presence of others, possible. And as we share in that, together we get to know God with people. I mean, that's what church is. It's opting in to know God with these people. Knowing God with these people. After Bible college, I actually at the very end of my fourth year of Bible college, of seminary, I had to do this internship at this church in the Midwest. It wasn't Michigan, different Midwest state. They may think they're from the Midwest, and you might not think they're from the Midwest. But I'll say they're from the Midwest for this, So I'm at this church, and really incredible pastor at this church, young guy, great communicator, really good at making the community feel safe for questions and whatever you want to be walking through. And much like our church, there was lots of people beginning to gather at this church who had passed church hurt. And the church was growing. It was a really beautiful thing. I grew up in a denomination, and this church was a part of a denomination where members and elders and pastors of this church were not allowed to drink alcohol. Just so you know, that's not a commandment in the Bible. But it actually started in a really good place. See, back during times of prohibition, the powers and principalities around the distribution of alcohol were taking advantage of poor and underserved communities. And we're using that as a way to keep people under oppression and keep them addicted and spending money on the alcohol rather than their house and their family and caring for people. So Christians back then got together and said, we are going to be a dry community we're going to stand up against those powers and principalities and create a safe place for people who want to stand up against those and heal from those things and get their life back together and take care of their families. This is where it started. Years and years later, not drinking alcohol became a law that God required of us to be a good Christian. Some of you grew up in these same kinds of cultures. And what I knew from leading worship in 4 churches a week inside of our denomination was there was lots of church members drinking alcohol. There was lots of board members having a glass of wine with their spouse on their anniversary or having a beer while watching a football game. What I knew is there was actually lots of pastors in this denomination drinking alcohol. Can you believe it? They might even have 2 beers once in a while. A few years after my internship, I got a call from some folks in the church that the denomination came along and we're going to take away this pastor's credentials because they found out he was having a beer a few times at a football game with his friends. And I understood that because, like we signed up to be pastors in the denomination. We knew the rules. But you know what really got me? You know how many pastors stood up on that day and said, hey, if you're going to take his credentials over this, you're going to have to take mine too. How many pastors do you think stood up in the denomination and said that? None. 0. Not a one. He took his credentials. A couple years later, church is gone. Everybody left. See, I think when we think about loyalty and honesty in theology, it kind of operates a bit like this Venn diagram. There's a relationship, a connection between all of these. And when we remove loyalty to humans, honesty and theology begin to be weapons of the institution, right? That honesty just becomes way too risky. I'm just going to hide my thoughts. I'm not going to say what my doubts are. I'm not going to be honest about my questions. I'm going to drink in silence and in quietness where nobody can see. Because honesty is just too risky. That because there's no loyalty to people, the institution will use that honesty against me. When we remove theology, right? It's easy to use loyalty and honesty as weapons against people. See, when we remove theology, we remove this understanding that you are a child of God and I am a child of God. That God invites you on this journey and God's okay with your questions and God invites me on this journey and God's okay with my questions. When we lose the theology that the overarching story here is this God who is ridiculously loyal to us. When we lose that theology, we turn on each other, don't we? We begin to think like, well, my thing is not as bad as your thing. My stuff is not as bad as your stuff. Actually, you should be really shamed for the stuff in your life. But the stuff in my life is just fine. Actually, you know what? Like, we over here, we don't have questions about the thing that you have questions about. And we think that your question is your question is worse than our questions. So you should just stay there while we keep doing our thing over here. We build these communities, these false communities. If we remove honesty and we just have loyalty and theology, well, eventually someone comes along and writes a new book for our community. And that book becomes like the bar that everybody who wants to belong has to meet. And you can't question this book because this book is our theology and we're loyal to this theology. I want to name something that some of us grew up in traditions where the way in which we were loyal to God was by being loyal to the church that we were a part of. That's wrong. That's wrong. Jesus said, my greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your being. And the second is just like it. It's equal. It's like all wrapped up in it. The second is just like it. It's to love your neighbor to yourself. How do we respond to the loyalty of God? It's not by being loyal to a church institution. It's about learning to love God with your heart and your soul and your mind, and that finding expression in the love of your neighbor as yourself. Healthy theology and loyalty should lead us to more honesty. If the kind of loyalty that is being demanded of you, especially in a church setting, is a loyalty that requires you to not tell the truth, is a loyalty that requires you to continue to perpetuate a lie in order to protect the institution, that is not the loyalty that Jesus calls his disciples to. That is not the kind of loyalty that God modeled for thousands of years through the Jesus story and through the Old Testament story. That a good test of is this loyalty healthy is the extent in which it helps us embody the presence of God and tell the truth about what's happening in our midst, in our world. I think we should learn to do maybe a better job of putting that to the test. I want to look at a passage of scripture that we've looked at actually twice, I think, in the last 4 weeks. It's a description of the early church in Acts chapter 4. And as I read it, I wonder if you can just maybe make marker notes about the relationship here between loyalty and theology and honesty. Acts chapter 4, starting in verse 32, says the community of believers was one heart and mind. None of them would say, "This is mine," about any of their possessions, but held everything in common. The apostles continued to bear powerful witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and an abundance of grace was at work among them all. There were no needy persons among them, and those who owned properties or houses would sell them, bring the proceeds from the sale, and place them in the care and under the authority of the apostles. Then it was distributed to anyone who was in need. So somewhere along the way, this group of people respond to the resurrection of Jesus. They're like, man, if this is who God is, I don't think it's right that I have this field over here and my brother or sister over here doesn't even have a place to live. If this is how the loyalty of God is, I mean, if God is so loyal to us that he would become us and give his life for us and die on a cross and resurrect from the dead, if that's the extent of that loyalty, what might God be inviting us into? Acts chapter 5 begins to tell a different story. When this was written, it wasn't like Acts chapter 4 and then Acts chapter 5. It was just one story. We added the chapters, and well, I say we like I was there. I had nothing to do with adding the chapters and verses of the Bible. But the church added chapters and verses of the Bible to make it easier to talk about what we're talking about, right? So we could reference this text over and over. It was a way to kind of help the church read and study the Bible together. So the beginning of Acts chapter 5 tells this story. But if you were finished reading chapter 4 and then put your Bible away for a month and then come back and read chapter 5, these stories seem really disconnected. But actually they're meant to be read together. They're meant to tell the same story or give two sides to the same story. Now the story we're going to look at in Acts chapter 5, if you were going to have a series at your church called Why I Stopped Going to Church, and you had a church with a lot of skeptics in it, this would probably not be the story that would be recommended reading. It's the story of Ananias and Sapphira. Right after the description of the generosity and the beauty and the theology and the loyalty of this community to one another in Acts chapter 4. It tells the story of Ananias and Sapphira. It says, however, right? So we just read about the community. However, there was these other two people. However, there was a man named Ananias who, along with his wife, Sapphira, sold a piece of property. With his wife's knowledge, he withheld some of the proceeds from the sale. That's probably healthy in your marriage, right? He brought the rest and placed it at the care and under the authority of the apostles. Peter knew they had held some back. Peter says, Ananias, how is it that Satan has influenced you to lie to the Holy Spirit by withholding some of the proceeds from the sale of your land? Wasn't that property yours to keep? Like, it is yours. Why are you going to lie about it? After you sold it, wasn't the money yours to do with whatever you wanted? Like, why are you lying about it? What made you think of such a thing? You haven't lied to other people, but to God. When Ananias heard these words, he dropped dead. I've never seen this happen before in the church. Everyone who heard this conversation was terrified. Yeah, I bet they were. Some young men stood up, wrapped up his body, carried him out, and buried him in the ground. About 3 hours later, his wife entered, but she didn't know what had happened to her husband. She hadn't caught up on the church group text yet, right? She didn't know. No idea. Peter asked her, tell me, what did you and your husband receive for this price for the field? She responded, yep, the amount we gave is what we received. He replied, how could you scheme with each other to challenge the Lord's Spirit? Look, he says, the feet of those who buried your husband at the door, they will carry you out too. At that very moment, she dropped dead at his feet. When the young men entered and found her dead, they carried her out and buried her with her husband. Trepidation and dread seized the whole church and all who heard what had happened. So the issue in this story, when you hold it up against the description of the community and the life of Ananias and Sapphira, this decision by Ananias and Sapphira, the issue was that they lacked honesty. So they faked loyalty and missed the whole point of the theology. They didn't want to be honest with themselves or with God. So they faked loyalty and missed the whole point of theology. I do wonder, just me here, right? How often do I lack honesty? And I would prefer the truth not be told, or I prefer not to maybe look deeper into my own soul or my own heart or some of the things going on inside of me. Like I'd prefer to keep that hidden. I prefer not to maybe walk through some of the stuff that God might be invited. Like I just prefer to not be honest, not look at that, not be vulnerable to that. And the way I protect myself, right, is just to fake loyalty so that everyone around me thinks, well, I'm a part of you. Like I'm the same as you. We're the same. We're all in this together. No issues here. Status quo. How often do I lack honesty, fake loyalty, and miss the whole point of theology? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Second commandment is just like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus calls his disciples without any requirement of theology. We don't even really need to be ready to tell the truth, because Jesus offers loyalty unconditionally and first to all of us. Man, I want to be loved like that. I want to be loved like that. See, Jesus' disciples, if you read in the Gospels, like they had honest moments. Like there was times when Jesus confronted his disciples, right? There's times when he offered correction or confrontation. But that was always followed by a new invitation of loyalty. But get this, it wasn't an invitation for them to be loyal to him. The confrontation, the correction was followed by a new invitation for them to receive his loyalty to them. He never required that loyalty back for them to belong at the table of Jesus. And it was through this journey that you can watch the disciples learn and get to know who Christ is. My hope with this series is that every week will maybe just like give us some handles to grab a hold of. I can't like solve all the problems. We can't answer like all the questions. Some of the things that you faced in the church and in your faith, I think some of these teachings in this month will be helpful, but it'll just be helpful. Like it's not gonna fix it all. My hope is that today, maybe you could think back to some of the experiences you've had in church and hold them up against this framework of loyalty and honesty and theology. Might give you some frameworks to maybe understand what went wrong, what happened, the ways in which the church or those people associated with the church weren't embodying the story that they claim. I think for those of us that this is our church, that Westwinds is our home, like we say we want to be a church for anyone, I think that requires of us to have these kinds of conversations, to admit when loyalty and honesty and theology in our midst are getting kind of out of order or disjointed or showing up in unhealthy ways, that we want to be a church that is getting healthier around these things. That ideally we don't make the same mistakes as our forefathers and our foremothers, that these sins of our past and of our time in the church don't just get passed on to us and we commit the same sins. I'd like to be able to commit our own sins. Well, we don't need to commit the same ones, right? For those of you that are putting this together, that you feel like maybe this series is a part of maybe helping you gain some clarity on some of the stuff that maybe has happened to you or around you in your life. I hope we can give you some handles or some steps of healing, but just to be explicit, like my hope is that maybe some of those steps of healing would be toward Jesus. That is my hope. But even more so, that those steps of healing would be towards Jesus in the presence of others. My guess is some of the stuff you've been through has been incredibly isolating. And I think there's this wide open invitation of Jesus to be with him, to follow him in the presence of others. I want to keep proclaiming that Jesus offers loyalty that is unnatural. I would argue it's supernatural. And out of that loyalty, Jesus embodies this culture of honesty, this culture of telling the truth, this culture where we can be vulnerable because it's safe to be vulnerable in the presence of Jesus. A culture where it's okay to be weak. Actually, it's not just okay to be weak. It's expected that we are weak, that there are parts of us that are weakness. That it's okay to not be okay. This culture where we embody this praxis of love. And in the midst of that Jesus is this way to this theology, this maybe right belief and right praxis, this way of being together, a way of knowing God through the life, death, resurrection of Jesus. Before we close, I just want to name one more thing as we're moving through this series. I just want to recognize the space that we're in. That for some of us, having this conversation inside of a church space creates all sorts of stuff. That hearing this conversation, maybe being guided or led by somebody who looks like me, sounds like me, embodies the kind of characteristics of me, can be hard and challenging. And I want to say, as a pastor, maybe on behalf of churches, behalf of my colleagues, I'm sorry for the ways in which the church or people associated with the church have screwed this up. I'm really sorry. I've sat and listened to too many stories, and it's got to be better. We have to do better. And that's not like a ladder to climb. It's grace that we need God to give us to be able to be healthy in the ways in which we model and live after this wildly loyal God. The ways in which we tell the truth together when it's uncomfortable and hard. The ways in which we get to know God in the presence of others. We need to invite that into our lives every single day, I think. I'll close with this. Some would say the most important thing in a church is doctrine. You got to find the church that has the right doctrine. If you find that church, would you let me know? A lot of people are looking for it. A lot of people have left this church looking for it. I disagree with that sentiment. I really disagree with that sentiment. I think the most important thing in a church is hospitality. That we collectively experience the hospitality of God so that we might receive others in the hospitality of God and be received by others in the hospitality of God. That is the space, I think, where we'll get to find out who God is in our midst and just what he might be inviting us into. The most important thing, I think, is that we learn to be received by God so we might receive others in the name of God and be received by others in the love of God. Pastor Josh got married 8 years ago. Christy, am I right? 8? Nailed it. I asked Josh earlier. He couldn't remember, so I'm just joking. I'm just kidding. I'm making that up. I wanted to make a scene. Okay, I'm just kidding. I had the privilege of officiating Josh and Christy's wedding. And the night before they got married, Josh gave us all, me and his groomsmen, a wallet like this. I've been carrying it around now for almost a decade. On the front of this wallet, it says loyalty over honesty. A conversation that him and I have been having for a decade and a half. And this is centered the kind of Christian I want to be, the kind of person I want to be, the kind of grace that I need from God, and the kind of church I long to be a part of. I'll take loyalty over honesty every day of the week and twice on Sundays, right? That's the saying.